In the dark, peaceful sky over a Thai jungle, a wide-body airliner is experiencing a chilling, unspoken emergency. It has just taken off from Bangkok, but a system malfunction is causing the aircraft to begin a sudden descent towards the mountains. Blindsided by the failure, the pilots begin an attempt to recover, but with every second, controlling the aircraft becomes harder and harder, and the tension rises. Will the flight crew have the chance to save it before it's too late? This is the story of Lauda Air Flight 004. In the late hours of May 26, 1991, a Boeing 767 was preparing to depart Bangkok International Airport after a quick stopover. The aircraft had begun its journey earlier in the day in Hong Kong and was making a scheduled stop in Thailand's capital city to pick up additional passengers on its way to Vienna, Austria. The 2-year-old Boeing was operated by Lauda Air, a leisure travel airline owned by a famous race car driver and a Formula One champion, Niki Lauda. In command of Lauda Air Flight 004 was Thomas John Welch, an experienced airline pilot with over 11,000 hours of flight time and type ratings for Boeing 727, 757 and 767 aircraft, as well as a flight engineer's certificate. His first officer, Joseph Thuma, had 6,500 hours of flight time under his belt. On the other side of the flight deck, 8 cabin crew members would be taking care of 213 passengers, mostly travelers from Austria, Hong Kong, and Thailand. Just before 11 p.m. local time, with all 223 people on board, in their seats and ready for the overnight journey, Flight 004 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing for takeoff. It was a nice and peaceful night in Bangkok, with calm winds, great visibility, and only some clouds in the area. The flight to Vienna was going to take approximately 11 hours, taking the passengers over parts of Asia and the Middle East, with a scheduled arrival in Austria shortly before 6 o'clock in the morning, just in time to begin the next day. Although the en route weather forecast showed some precipitation and high-level cloud formations, there were no hazards in the forecast that would significantly affect the flight. After finishing the pre-departure checks, the crew of Lauda Air 004 taxied the aircraft onto the runway and applied takeoff power, marking the beginning of their flight back to Austria. At 11:02 p.m., the 767 lifted off the ground and, waking up local neighborhoods, started a gentle climb to the initial altitude of 7,000 feet. A few minutes later, air traffic control cleared Flight 004 to continue the climb to their planned cruise altitude of 31,000 feet, an altitude that the aircraft would never reach. It was not much longer than 5 minutes after takeoff that the first warning bells, in this case quite literally, began to ring, indicating a problem on board. The quiet serenity of the late-night departure was suddenly disturbed by the aircraft's master caution annunciator, a blinking yellow light on the main panel. Although not as severe as a master warning light, which indicates a failure that requires immediate action, a lit-up master caution light was a sign that one of the aircraft's systems was malfunctioning. To further investigate the problem that triggered the annunciator, the pilots referred to the engine indication and crew alerting system. Also known as ICAS, this centrally located display provides information about engine parameters as well as text messages regarding issues that trigger the master caution light. As it turned out, there was a malfunction within the thrust reverse system of the left engine, more specifically, one of its hydraulic valves.
Before we continue, I want to thank the paid partner of today's video, BetterHelp. Honestly, life can get pretty heavy sometimes. You try to keep things together, but stress just builds up in the background until it feels like too much. I remember a point when I was ready to give up on something I'd worked so hard for. I kept it bottled up for weeks, thinking I had to deal with it alone. What finally helped was just talking it out, being honest about how I felt, and slowly finding a way forward. That's what BetterHelp is for. It's the biggest online therapy platform in the world, with thousands of credentialed therapists who actually get what you're going through. And you don't have to sit in a waiting room or drive across town. You can talk to a therapist on video, on the phone, or even just by chat, whatever feels easiest. And if the first one doesn't feel like the right match, you can switch until you find someone who clicks. With a 4.3-star Trustpilot rating and millions of people already using it, BetterHelp has helped a lot of people take that first step. If you want to give it a try, head to betterhelp.com/aircrashinvestigation or pick Air Crash Investigation at sign up for 10% off your first month. Because honestly, starting is the hardest part, and BetterHelp makes that easier. Now let's get back to the video.
To better understand why this caution light was a concern, it is important to discuss the basic operation of a thrust reverser and its effect on an aircraft as large as the Boeing 767. Part of the turbofan engine, such as the type that was installed on Lauda Boeing 767 aircraft, a thrust reverser is a complex system consisting of multiple moving components. A turbofan engine creates propulsion by a combination of core thrust and bypass thrust. The core, or exhaust thrust, is generated from the internal combustion process by burning the fuel supplied to the engine. The bypass thrust is created from the large, aerodynamically shaped fan blades at the front of the engine that rotate at a high speed, accelerating the incoming air and routing it around the engine core, thus bypassing it. It is the bypass thrust that can also be used to slow down an aircraft on the ground by the use of a cascade reverse thrust system. Commanded by the thrust reverse levers in the flight deck, an outer sleeve of the engine slides back, blocking the bypass airflow from traveling further and instead rerouting it outside and toward the front of the engine through a series of cascade vanes. The force of the air moving in the opposite direction of travel is strong enough to effectively slow down a heavy airliner after a touchdown. The thrust reverser is moved by a series of push rods and control arms, which are actuated by hydraulic fluid, with two valves controlling its operation. A hydraulic isolation valve, or HIV, manages the supply of hydraulic fluid to the actuators, allowing the operation of the thrust reverser only when the HIV is open. Once it opens, the hydraulic fluid travels to the directional control valve, or DCV, which will use the hydraulic fluid to either open or close the cowl, depending on the command received from the thrust lever. A thrust reverser is only designed to operate on the ground and to safeguard against unintended operation of either valve. A series of sensors measures the weight applied to the landing gear to determine its state. These sensors, however, can be bypassed if the system detects that the cowl is deployed when it is supposed to be stowed, a condition called auto-restow. In this case, the aircraft will supply hydraulic power to the thrust reversers and command it to close even in the air. It was the hydraulic isolation valve that triggered the master caution light on Flight 004. The aircraft systems sensed that the valve was open while the thrust reverse lever was in the closed position, indicating a disagreement. Following company procedures, the flight crew referred to the Quick Reference Handbook, or QRH. As the name implies, the QRH includes a list of checklists and procedures developed by the aircraft manufacturer for flight crews to address and troubleshoot messages and other common malfunctions while in flight. Because of the multiple safeguards implemented to prevent the thrust reverser from deploying in the air, the issue with the isolation valve was considered by Boeing to be cautionary in nature, and it was not an emergency matter. No additional action was required, but a warning note stated that any additional system malfunctions during the flight could increase the risk of an uncommanded deployment of the thrust reversers in flight. Concerned about the issue, First Officer Thumer asked the captain whether the crew needed to call a company maintenance representative to ask for their input. Captain Welch, however, did not find it necessary. He suggested that it was most likely moisture inside the sensor that was triggering a false caution message. He did not believe that there was an actual failure within the system, as the caution message kept appearing and disappearing. It seemed more likely to be a nuisance alert, which is not uncommon in all aircraft types. "It's just an advisory thing," the captain concluded, highlighting that even the manufacturer's guidelines did not consider further action to be necessary. The flight crew made a decision to proceed to Vienna, and the 767 continued its climb. Things had once again quieted down, and the major trouble seemed to have been resolved. And yet, only 10 minutes after the master caution light came on for the first time, the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder recorded a chilling message from the first officer.
Reversers deployed.
As the Boeing 767 was passing 24,000 feet at a speed of over 400 knots, with both engines running at near full power, the outer sleeve of the left engine moved back, activating the thrust reverser. In a matter of seconds, the situation on board Flight 004 had turned from a quiet and peaceful departure to a critical emergency. Although multiple safeguards have been implemented to prevent its operation in the air, an in-flight deployment of a thrust reverser is not a fully unexpected event. On the contrary, aircraft design standards, under which the Boeing 767 model was certified, required to make it controllable with one engine thrust reverser deployed in flight. However, all flight testing had been done at much lower altitudes and engines at idle power, and the standards that required this testing were developed many years earlier. Back then, engines were smaller, located further from the wing leading edge, and thus had a smaller effect on the airflow over the wing. All of these factors combined made the crew of Flight 004, the unwitting test pilots and everyone else behind their backs, the silent observers of what was about to unfold. A sudden shift in the direction of engine thrust of this magnitude from the deployment of the reverser affected the aircraft in several ways. Because the right engine continued to provide takeoff thrust, the aircraft began to yaw to the left. But more importantly, the application of reverse thrust created a plume of air around the left engine, traveling out and causing a disruption to the smooth airflow over the left wing. This air disturbance over the wing led to a 25% reduction in lift. And as the airflow over the right wing was not interrupted, the resulting imbalance caused the 767 to start banking to the left. Having lost a significant portion of engine thrust and wing lift, the 767 was no longer climbing. Instead, the aircraft entered a steep spiral, pointing its nose toward the ground. Among the intense sounds of the air hitting the windshield and the screams of utterly terrified passengers, a loud, intrusive siren blared through the flight deck, adding to the overall cacophony. Accelerating in the dive, the aircraft had exceeded its maximum design airspeed, triggering the overspeed warning. Any extra knot of airspeed at this point pushed the aircraft closer and closer to its design limits, making the flight controls feel heavy and sluggish and putting the structural integrity of the entire aircraft in jeopardy. The crew had shut down the left engine and the thrust reverser was no longer affecting the flight, but the aircraft was still hurtling toward the ground, placing the pilots in an unprecedented dilemma. If the dive was not stopped in time, the airframe would no longer be able to sustain the extreme forces pressing against it. At the same time, any movement of the flight control surfaces in an attempt to recover from the dive would intensify the forces already acting on the aircraft. The recovery had to be quick yet smooth, and with every second in the rapid descent, the chances of survival were diminishing. A few seconds later, the pilots began to pull back on the yoke and gradually raise the nose. In an instant, the left elevator reached its load limit, snapped, and tore away from the horizontal stabilizer. This loss created a bigger aerodynamic imbalance, causing the airframe to rotate around its axis, further aggravating the brutal forces and triggering a vicious cycle. From now on, it was only a matter of time until the horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizers failed, leaving the aircraft completely uncontrollable. The rest of the airplane continued to accelerate toward the ground, exceeding the speed of sound, which bent the wings downward. The sparks produced by the wings snapping and separating from the aircraft ignited the fuel remaining in the wing tanks. What was once a state-of-the-art airliner carrying 223 souls had turned into a giant fireball, helplessly falling toward the ground. At 11:17 p.m., Lauda Air Flight 004 forever disappeared from the air traffic control radar. Following the in-flight breakup, the wreckage was spread out over a large area in a hard-to-access and uninhabited area. By the time the rescue teams had arrived, a significant portion of the wreckage had burned down, including the flight data recorder and most of the electronic components. Only the cockpit voice recorder was recovered and could still be readable, making it the key piece of evidence in the investigation. In cooperation with international partners such as Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, and the National Transportation Safety Board, the aircraft investigations team from Thailand reviewed multiple scenarios, considering faults within the electrical system as well as the uncommanded mechanical actuation of the valves. Through a series of tests and investigation efforts, it was determined that an electrical short circuit or contamination, such as dirt and dust, could have activated the directional control valve to the deployed position. In combination with the auto-restow system that opens the hydraulic isolation valve when it suspects that the thrust reverser cowl is not in the stowed position, this condition could have supplied enough hydraulic pressure to deploy the thrust reverser. To the great sorrow of everyone on board Lauda Air Flight 004 and their families, we will never learn the true cause of the accident. One thing was made certain: with the rapid loss of lift over the left wing as a result of the thrust reverser deployment, the flight crew of Lauda Flight 004 had only 6 seconds to respond before the recovery was no longer possible. Hardly enough time for a situation that nobody could ever predict.